Good morning, everyone. Brian Post here, and welcome to session 2 of the 16-week Adoption Parenting Coaching and Certification course. I hope everyone is doing well. This morning, we are going to continue to build somewhat. Last in the first session, I talked about kind of the three different adoption experiences, mine, my sister's, and then a client that I worked with some years ago, and how the histories are different. And we also talked a bit about, understanding the many layers of adoption. It's not just the adopted child, it's also the history behind that child and the early experiences from conception, and then it's also the behind the child in that regard. It's the biological parent's history, and then it's the adoptive parent's history. So everything to the greatest extent possible has to be taken into consideration when we are looking at adoption specifically. But that applies, just like I said in the first session. We're focused here on adoption coaching, parent coaching, but you can substitute adoption for biological, foster child, grandchild. It doesn't matter. This work, the application of the work does not change. It stays the same. It's applicable. It's human behavior. So just want to establish that. So we're going to go ahead and in session 2, we're going to continue to look at the foundation, the building blocks of the experience of the family, and primarily this morning we're going to be talking about the adoptive parent experience and kind of looking at those dynamics a little bit, and looking at from the parent perspective. The key, probably the ultimate key to all of the work regarding love-based parenting is we have to be able to be in a place to where we can create a regulated oxytocin enriching experience, in any given moment. And the thing is, I say any given moment, and let me really clarify that to some degree, because attachment, we talk about the process of attachment, which is the dyadic regulation of two peoples. Let me get my little pen active here. So we're talking about attachment. This is how attachment is defined. The dyadic, that means two, regulatory relationship which occurs moment to moment. Yeah, I might have butchered that definition a little bit. Ultimately, attachment is the dyadic regulatory relationship. That when it comes right down to it. So when I say that, it's the ability of two people to regulate emotions together. And the process of doing that is what creates the attachment bond. But what you have to understand about attachment is that it's a two-way street. It requires not only the presence or I might say the absence of stress, but it also requires the presence of stress. So it's not just because you're in a stressful experience, doesn't mean that there's not attachment being created, because what has to happen is it's the repair of the strain. It's the repair of the stress and the dysregulation which secures the attachment bond even more. So it's like exercising a muscle. When we go and exercise a muscle, what we're actually doing is we're tearing down those muscle fibers. And then by the very process of tearing them down and then resting, See, you think the working out is really what's important, but it's not just the working out. It's also the resting that allows the recovery and then the growth of the muscle, the strengthening of the muscle, because once the muscle gets torn down, as it repairs itself, it comes back stronger. And that's the same thing with attachment. Once there is stress that occurs in the relationship, it's the ability to repair that stress that restores the attachment at a stronger level. And this is really where a lot of families get stuck, because when there is stress, as there is when parenting adopted children, when there is strain, we start to become conditioned to stay focused in the strain. We start to become conditioned to stay focused and connected to the stress that is being created. So what we end up doing is we end up losing the repair. And we're going to get into why this occurs, because you can look at all of this from a foundation of the brain. But when we stay in that constant state of stress, it's literally like we're not giving our brains an opportunity for recovery. Now, it's one thing for the child to stay in that state. It's another thing for the parent to stay in the state, because ultimately the parent is the ultimate regulatory figure in the life of the child, because oxytocin is a learned response. And oxytocin is the hormone that allows bonding to occur, attachment to occur. But it's learned, and it's learned from the parent's brain to the child's brain. Now, depending on how early trauma occurs, that reflects how difficult it can be to teach the oxytocin response, but nevertheless, it occurs between the parent and the child. So the main one of the main points that I want to make in that is that when you're going through a stressful time with your child, when a parent is going through a stressful time with the child, that's okay. You have to suspend judgment. Like, when things are happening in a way that you would rather them not be happening. I mean, your child's acting out, you're acting out, because when we're stressed out, we act out. So you're acting out, the child's acting out. See, that's okay, because at a level that is stretching the brain's stress response. But when you are able to get through that moment, and when you can settle yourself down, and then when you can go and repair that experience with the child, then what you're doing is you're increasing that child's oxytocin response. So then that's when you repair the strain of the attachment. So it's like during the time that you're really stressed, it's like you're really exercising that muscle. Now, what we have to get focused on is how we repair it after we've already created that strain, or how to get families to stop reinforcing the negative feedback that's occurring. So to interrupt that constant working out, that constant, damage to the attachment system, and get them to interrupt it, to start to repair and heal and regenerate and revitalize the attachment relationship, and be able to create a regulatory opportunity to be able to help with that strain that's been created. And that's important, because my wife and I were having a conversation just the other morning, and I was saying, or she was talking about how grateful she was for her life, and how sometimes how God continues to forgive her and be patient with her, because she's not always grateful. And she's like, you know what? It's only like 20% of the time, 10% of the time that anything, it's not even that often that something that's not going my way, or that something has not gone my way in my life, and I can just be so ungrateful. But the reality is I have a wonderful life. And I said, the same thing happens with families. It's only 10% of the time when you really have something going on that's creating a lot of stress and a lot of strain. If you think about it, it's not the greater amount of the day. Think about, and some of you may even want to, measure this yourself, or you can ask families to do this, to time it. And see, this is important because, see, I say stuff like this and people are like, okay, so here's what I'm going to say. Don't do anything different. Just let the same chaos occur that's been occurring, if that's the situation, and just time how frequently it occurs during the course of a day. Just go normal day to day. Now that's going to influence the response, the kind of the situation, the energy that gets created somewhat, because just by timing it, literally timing it, your child is you ask them to do something and they won't do it. You can start at that time right there and, just time it all the way through the process. You don't have to do anything different. You can do things the same way you've always done them. If people are like, you're encouraging parents to like just let things be stressful. Yes, because as you're doing that, you're becoming more mindful of the time that's involved, and I want you to do that through the course of an entire day, because what you're going to find is the time that you're engaged in stressful situations doesn't come anywhere close to the amount of time of the rest of the day. So you're in a stressful situation with your child for 5 minutes or for 2 hours. Let's say the child rages for 2 hours. Well, then that goes away. Well, see, here's what happens is because of stress hormones and how they course through our brains and our bodies, and this was something that I used to really reflect to foster parents, and it's very important for adoptive parents too, especially when there's a situation when there's a two-parent household, the child has to go, from house to house, or a divorced children of divorce, I should say, where the child has to go from house to house, is that after you have experienced a highly stressful moment, after you've gone through that cortisol is rushing through your brain and your body, and it can take anywhere from 24 to 72 hours to clear through. So high levels of cortisol reaction in the brain take up to 72 hours to clear through the body. So what I used to help foster parents understand is that when a child has a visit and they go away from you, and this is the environment of their security, when they come back, the reason they're acting out is because they're stressed out, and the reason it takes 2 to 3 days to get them settled again is because that's how long it takes for cortisol to flush through the body. Now, if you think about that in a family situation, you have a stress spike. You have a stress spike that occurs. You think of a heart monitor and all of a sudden, doot, 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 it just jumps up. That stress spike is now flooding everyone's brain and everyone's body. And those hormones have to work themselves through. If you're not able to turn oxytocin on before the next stress spike, well, then now you got more cortisol in the body. And then if you're not able to turn on, like if you go away, your child goes to their room and you go to your room, or you go for a walk or whatever, and you guys just aren't in a good space before the next incident occurs, then you got more stress. Pretty soon, these incidents themselves may only last 5 minutes at a time. See, and then there's separation. So you have a stressful moment, then there's separation. So the child is, going off and playing or doing whatever, and you're going off and doing whatever you do. Well, then what happens is, because there's no actual repair occurring, before you know it, the entire body, it's like a sponge, is flush full, just has soaked up cortisol. And then you move into the next day, and then the next day, and then the next day, and the next day, and then there's no relief for the brain and the body. And even when you get away from your child, or you get away from the environment, the situation, and you maybe do something fun for a little while, the oxytocin that you experience in that moment isn't enough to help calm all of the cortisol that's flushing through your brain and your body. And so then this becomes conditioned. See, we have to be able to interrupt that. And that's why when you take a level of mindfulness into parenting, when something happens that's stressful, you can take a step back after it's occurred and you can say, wow, let's look at this situation for a minute. What could I have done differently? What did my child need in that moment? You know, what was going on leading up to that moment? How did that make me feel? You know, what was going on with me? So as soon as you start asking those questions, you start breathing, you start calming yourself down, you immediately start to reduce the cortisol presence in your brain. And then you start to move back into oxytocin. So you start to calm the amygdala, and the oxytocin is starting to flow again, and you start to calm yourself down and you feel better. Then you go and you create an opportunity for repair with your child. You know, whatever, in however manner that might look, you have to go and create that opportunity, because otherwise cortisol is still flushing their brains. And they haven't yet learned how to turn on enough oxytocin for that to not occur, or to be able to calm that down themselves. So I hope that makes sense, because that is so much of the foundation of today's class, is just looking at how can we sufficiently interrupt our own cortisol reactions. And I really like to think of, when, you know, I talked last week about the importance of words. I really like for people to keep in mind reaction versus response. It's important, because a lot of times even scientists talk about how the brain responds. The brain is not responding to stressful situations. What the brain does to stressful situations is it reacts. So when that stress outpouring occurs in response to whatever, that is a reaction. And a reaction means it is unconscious. And that means it is without thought, and it is emotional. That is a reaction. See, there's no thought associated with reaction. See, with a response, not only is that oxytocin, when you are able to respond instead of react, but it requires thought. It is not emotional, and if it is emotional, it is much more conscious. Much more conscious, more cognitive. So there's emotion attached to it, but the emotion isn't dictating the outcome. The emotion isn't dictating what is occurring in that moment. The person is able to override the emotion, the strong fear, the fear-based reaction that's occurring, and release more oxytocin in a moment to require you to be able to think more clearly and be more conscious and to be more cognitive. And so it's very important. See, I still say response. Sometimes when the brain responds, but every time I say how the brain responds, I know I'm talking about a reaction. So it starts very early. We call it the stress response system. It's not the stress response system. It's the stress reaction system. And I think that it's very important how we express things, because it really has implications for what's reflected in our bodies and in our brains. There's in Stress, Trauma, and the Brain. Was that the name of it? It was a DVD that I was on. No. It's called Trauma, Brain, and Relationship. And I'm going to send you all that in a link, because I know we've got it there on YouTube somewhere. I'm going to make that a part of your assignment for this next week, just to watch that. And some of you, I'm sure, have seen it before, but if you haven't, I want you to watch. I've seen that video. Oh my gosh, 500 times. And so I hear things in it that other people don't always hear, just because I've watched it so much. I show it in all my lectures for the most part, so I get to see it over and over and over again. And there's a part in there where Daniel Siegel, who's brilliant, he is talking about a child having a trauma-based reaction, and he says it's not like you don't get ice cream, and so they get upset. And in that statement, I'm thinking in my mind, for a child who's got a history of neglect, not getting ice cream could be life or death. So it's just interesting how we can say things without really thinking. I mean, you really have to keep in mind, you have to be mindful of the intensity at every level that we're discussing things and looking at things. All right, let's move on. Let's see. I'm going to move on as soon as I figure out how to advance these slides. No. It's not working on my screen. Okay. Let's erase the drawings here. The first 3 years of our lives, one of my how do you say favorite? One of my favorite quotes from John Bowlby. Seems weird to say favorite, but it's one of my favorite quotes from John Bowlby. I think it's one of the most significant scientific quotes ever. The first 3 years of our life establishes the blueprint for all of our future relationships. The first 3 years of our life establish the blueprint for all of our future relationships. I want you to think about that, from the perspective of who you are as an individual, and who parents are. And this is very important. So I kind of I'm going to speak to this kind of in two ways, because it's important for parents to keep in mind, not to keep in mind, but to really give consideration to who they are and when they started. And also as a coach, to keep in mind, the same thing. Whatever the parent is bringing to the table, they're bringing themselves to the table, and how meaningful and how significant that is, how impactful that is. Let me make sure this was the right slide. Yep, that's the right slide. So, what were your first 3 years of life like? And I like to think about this first from the perspective of myself. Think about yourself. The more you can really focus, and this, I don't know, maybe it sounds counterintuitive, but I believe that this is important. The more you can really focus on yourself, the more you can understand your child, because the focus on yourself gives you a framework of understanding that you may not have had previously. And that's even as a coach, you have to look at this information in relationship to you. I mean, I can't be more adamant about that point. You have to not just focus on the child. That's the wrong direction. Because as long as you're focused on the child, your amygdala, we talked about last week in the last class, how your amygdala is always looking for a threat. And as it's looking for a threat, it's causing confusion, distorted thinking, it's suppressing the short-term memory. See, as long as you're focused on someone else, you're always going to be scanning, looking for a threat. You can't be focused on someone else. You have to be focused on yourself. And as you are focused on yourself, the regulation that gets created within you opens you up to be in consideration of other people. It opens you up to seek to understand them, as opposed to moving into being understood. I knocked that off from St. Francis. Well, I knocked it off from Stephen Covey. Seek first to understand, then to be understood, who knocked it off from St. Francis a long time ago. So I really want you to look, what were your first 3 years of life like? And when did that life start? You began at conception. So go all the way back. And sometimes you have to generalize if you don't really know. If you don't really know the circumstances going on with mom and dad, as you were conceived and what life was like during those 9 months. But Mitch Gaynor, the author of Sounds of Healing, it's an excellent book, he says that as early as the 4th week after conception, the fetus is capable of hearing. So I'll just write that down. Mitch Gaynor. Sounds of Healing. This book came out years ago, probably 10 years ago now. It says as early as the 4th week after conception, the fetus is capable of hearing. What were you hearing as early as the 4th week after conception? As early as the 2nd trimester, the fetus is capable of psychological processing. What were you hearing and thinking while you were in the womb? See, that becomes very important. That's so significant because this goes into the framework, creating the framework of who you are. And you have to have that understanding from the very beginning. And then what were those 3 years? I like to take conception to 3. What were those 3 years like? Because when you become stressed as a parent, that is where you go back to. That is your brain stem. We're going to look at the brain here in a minute, but if you think about it this way, kind of like a funnel, here's your brain stem. In all of your earliest experiences, sit down there. Well, when you become stressed, that stress pours in and stirs all of this up. And so when it gets stirred up, that's what comes out. That's what Bruce Perry calls states. States become traits of your personality. See, your personality is stored down here along with in your brainstem with all those old memories. So all your oldest memories stay down here at we're talking about 98% unconscious down at this level until you start to think about things like this, until you start to really process and start to connect to what those early years were like, what those early experiences were, and then you start to feel. See, it's not enough to just think about those early experiences. I want you to feel them because I want you to create a framework within yourself. It goes back to the lens I talked about in the last class. I want you to create a framework that actually is reflected through the lens, through how you see. It's like what shows up in the world, but you have to have that understanding. So you have to be able to feel those things. I mean, I have spent so much time in the emotions associated with my birth. I've spent so much time in the emotions associated with the birth canal itself, associated with being in the womb. It's just like when I sat down with my biological mother and I said, what was that experience like? And she was telling me, and I just wanted to feel it in my body, and I could just feel the emotions, and we were both just crying and just sad and just right there in that sorrow. Well, see, my ability to go in and to feel that gives me a more conscious understanding of what's down here at this brainstem level. So instead of being 98% unconscious, I can start to change that. I can start to reduce that number over time so that I can become more and more conscious of these deep early messages. And the reason I want to become more and more conscious of those deep early messages is because that's what gets stirred up in stress. When we become stressed, when you become stressed out with your child, that is what's getting stirred up. What you're feeling, what's going on, the experiences are way up here. You know, it's like the iceberg. You got the iceberg and you got the water, and all you see is the iceberg. But what you don't understand is that that iceberg, you know, 90% of that iceberg is down here underneath the water where you can't see it. So the things that are going on, the stress, the behaviors of your child, your own behaviors, you know, your feelings, the emotions that are causing those feelings, you know, the fear underneath there, all that is just on the surface. It's just getting you stirred up, and it's coming all the way down here to the bottom of the iceberg, and it's stirring all that up, and it's rocking the whole iceberg. The whole iceberg just rocks. All right, so I'm spending a lot of time on that. It's just important. I want you to understand. I spend so much time on this kind of stuff because this is the foundation. This is the foundation of everything that I do. This is how I look at everything when it comes to working with families. All right. Come on. So let's make an important jump, and we've already made this jump at some level, but let's make an important jump. What are the behaviors you struggle with the most from your child? Right now, I want you to think about that. I want you to think about that. Whatever behaviors there are. If you've read The Great Behavior Breakdown, you know I list 27 of the most difficult behaviors. What are those behaviors? What are the ones that you really struggle with the most? And as you think about that, here's something I want you to understand. The behaviors that you struggle with the most, so the behaviors that are kind of at the top, you know, these are the ones that are occurring the most often. Those behaviors go all the way down to your brain stem and get something specific stirred up. The behaviors you struggle with your child the most send a message to you. And I don't know what that message is, but at the brain stem, that's what's getting stirred up. And a lot of times that message is not good enough, the fear, or it feels like rejection. A lot of parents feel rejected by their child, or it stirs up helplessness. So a lot of times, as small children, we felt helpless, but now that we're older, we don't get it. It's not as conscious anymore because we feel like we have so much more power and control. But as soon as those behaviors stir up that brainstem helplessness, then you're literally a small child again. When you stress, you regress, and that's the essence of this. Behaviors are stress, and that stress just sends a signal to your brainstem that stirs you up, which means regressing you back to an earlier stage. So you have to understand what that connection. If you can, it's to give you an example. One of the things that parents really struggle with is aggression. Why do some parents really struggle with aggression and other parents don't? It's because for those parents, aggression stirs something at the level of their brainstem that it doesn't stir for another parent, you know. Or it could be strong emotion. Oh, that's a common one, and that's so common because a lot of us were raised with strong emotion. What's the strongest emotion as an infant? It's crying. So you were raised where crying's not okay. So as soon as your child starts to demonstrate strong emotion, guess what? It takes you right back to a time that says that's not okay. See, this is all very powerful. Another one that's very common, oh my gosh, you know, sexual acting out. I mean, that one really stresses parents out. And the reason that really stresses some parents out is because it goes right down to the brainstem. So there's messages of shame, it's embarrassment, you know, or that it's wrong. See, that's a strong one right there. You know, if you have a message down here, an experience down here that says anything connected to sex is wrong, then guess what? You're going to get really stirred up. And as soon as that gets stirred up, it just drives all of these really strong emotions up from it, really strong, intense fear and helplessness. It's really strong. So what you have to do is you have to understand the connection, and you might have a difficult time making the connection. And that's okay, but let me tell you something. It's worth spending time thinking about it. It's worth spending time thinking about it, because if you can make the connection, what you want to do is you want to feel it. You want to see it, because it's not about this. It's not about the aggression. It's not about the sexual acting out. It's not about the strong emotion. It's not about that at all. That's just an opportunity for you to feel, you know, the helpless, the not good enough, the rejection, the shame, the embarrassment, the wrong, whatever that is. See, all of this is just an opportunity. It's an invitation. I call them emotional invitations. It's an emotional invitation for you to feel this down here. So if you can make the connection and understand it, the next thing you want to do is you want to feel it, because in the feeling of it, you will be able to master it. And that's what's important. When it shows up, you might not always be able to catch it in the moment, but ultimately, eventually, you want to be able to master it. And it will continue to show up until you master it in a level that it becomes more conscious, that you have more control over it. See, a lot of times we think we have control over our feelings. That's not true. We don't have control over our feelings, our emotions. Our emotions have control over us. That's why they pop up so unexpectedly. That's why it's so intense sometimes. That's why we feel so helpless, because we don't have control over our emotional state. Our emotional state has control over us. So when you can spend time really understanding, you know, next time you really have an intense experience with your child, just spend some time asking yourself, what is that about? What is that really about? It could be a really intense experience with your spouse. Say, what is that about? Make that connection and then feel it. Oh my gosh, what does that feel like? What does that feel like? What is that need? What is that longing? What's there? And then that process, just that little process, A and B, A leads to B, is then you can start to master it. When you can do that, you'll really see a shift in your reaction to your child's behavior. You know, why are you reacting so strongly to that behavior? It's because it's connected to something. All emotional reactivity stems from unfinished business. I'm going to write that one down. That in fact, that needs to be written down all by itself. All emotional reactivity stems from unfinished business. All emotional reactivity stems from unfinished business. It has far less to do with the place or the thing or the experience. It has far more to do with what's going on for you in that moment. And so it's very important that you can make that connection, if at all possible. And a lot of times, we as parents can be very resistant to doing this, making that connection, exploring that. But it is very important that you do. And then I want to talk a little bit about
what's significant with the brain, when we talk about stress, emotion, and brain development, so when we're looking at those things, as I was talking about the brain stem, how all that information gets stored up, and it's our amygdala that really, is out here kind of scanning the environment, and anytime you see the negative behavior, it's our amygdala that gets triggered and starts releasing all the stress hormones. Well, see, it's our ability to calm ourselves down, which ultimately is our own oxytocin response, the strength of our own oxytocin response that allows us to calm our amygdala down and then to look at the negative behaviors in a different way. So it's a very important dynamic that occurs within each of us, is when we have that initial stress reaction from our amygdala, it's the strength of our own oxytocin response that allows us to change what we're seeing from a threat to a cry for help. And you can look at negative behavior as a cry for help, but we don't see it that way. We usually see it as a threat, and what we have to do is we have to be able to get back to looking at it as a cry for help. So that becomes very, very important. Let me just get over to the next slide. Then there's a stress model. I want to look at the stress model in relationship to us as individuals. The stress model says all behavior, and you should just write this out along with me, all behavior arises from a state of stress. And in between the behavior and the stress is the presence of emotion. There are only two primary emotions, love and fear. It is through the expression, the processing, and the understanding of the fear that we can calm the stress and then diminish the behavior. But the key here is all behavior arises from a state of stress. And anytime your brain experiences stress, it sends that chemical reaction which creates cellular survival. So all of your cells constrict into survival the moment you become stressed. That state of survival is connected to fear. And that fear is an energy. The definition of energy, the definition of emotion is energy in motion. So the stress creates the emotion, which becomes the fear. So fear is not just being afraid of something in the way that we usually see something that's threatening that it makes us fearful. Fear is about a cellular experience that occurs that creates an energy which your brain then perceives and then calls it a feeling. So the question here is, when you see negative behaviors, how does that influence your own behavior? Because when you see negative behavior, which you view as a threat, and that creates stress for you, which then creates fear, then what kind of behavior does that create? What happens with your behavior? What does your behavior look like in the moment of stress? I want you to spend more time thinking about that. Over the course of the week, I want you to think about these things. I don't even want, I know sometimes when working with your child and raising your child, you can feel so desperate. You can feel so worried about, what's going on right now, that all you want to do is focus on making things better. All you want to do is focus on survival. See, that's what it becomes. And I'm just pulling up the brain slide again, because as long as you're focused on that negative behavior, as long as that's what your brain is focused on, that's what you're kind of consumed with, then you are going to continue to pump out stress hormones and continue to reduce your oxytocin response. That's why that's why I would rather, try to pull you away from the constant focus on your child's negative behaviors and get you to thinking about what your own reactions are, what your own feelings and stress are that are occurring in those instances. Because that's what I want you to master. I want you to be able to master your own awareness, your own stress that occurs when we start thinking about, the behaviors. When you start thinking about the behavior, your own behavior, before you're thinking about your child's behavior. So be looking at, what is the behavior for you that's being triggered when you become stressed. And then as you look at the behavior, then you start to take a moment and you reflect on what is creating this fear. What is that fear really about? And that goes back to, understanding, connecting, mastering. So you have to do that for yourself, because that's what's going to help you transcend and to be able to look at your child differently in those moments. But until you can pay attention to that for yourself, it's going to be really difficult for you to capture that experience with your child. So let's talk about the 3 pathways of emotion real quick. But I think I've really covered for the morning where I want you to focus. But I'm going to give you this last thought, because the brainstem activation that we've talked about, so the brainstem activation, which is all the old memories, the stress reaction that's occurring in that experience, the fear that's getting created, and then the behavior that's driving, all of that comes back and reflects through the 3 pathways of emotional expression, which are attitudes, feelings, and behaviors. These we all have 3 pathways through which we express our emotion. And the reason you want to express your emotion is you want to release the negative energy. You want to release the positive energy. Any overwhelming buildup of energy in your body can eventually be not good. And that's why stress, it's not that stress is all bad. Stress is very good. It helps you, that's a part, like we talked about, that's part of attachment and helping create that stronger regulatory system. However, any buildup of even good feelings. And last night we had a surprise birthday party for my wife, and there were instances where we were laughing so hard that it could become uncomfortable to the stomach. You laugh so hard that your stomach hurts. You laugh so hard that your head hurts. You laugh so hard that your jaws hurt. See, even laughter, which is a stress reaction, can become uncomfortable. It can lead to a state of discomfort. So all of these things are about expressing our emotions. Well, here's the thing. As children, were attitudes okay to be expressed? For you, was it okay to roll your eyes? Was it okay to huff and puff? Usually not. So then that pathway gets suppressed. And then was it okay to express your feelings as a child? How many of you grew up hearing as a child, suck it up, or you don't talk to me that way, or, until you pay the bills, you don't have an opinion. You hear lots of messages that say your feelings are not okay, so you learn to suppress your feelings. And then when you suppress your attitudes, you suppress your feelings, eventually it drives behaviors. So the only way to release at that point, is through behavior. And then what did you get as a child when it came to expressing behaviors? It wasn't okay. You sure didn't want to express behaviors, because that was guaranteed to get you a spanking. So then we just step to, the adults step up to another level of suppression. So it's like it's one thing to suppress the attitudes with a verbal reprimand. It's one thing to suppress feelings by having stronger feelings. So if the child's yelling, then the parent yells bicker. But then it's a whole nother level of intensity, energetic intensity, when it becomes behaviors. When you can't express through your attitudes and you can't express through your feelings, you must express through your behaviors. Now, here's the thing with adopted children and adopted families, with families in general, parents, we become stuck at the level of behavior because we don't have any other framework for being able to express our emotions. We have not learned that it's okay. Not only is it okay, it's necessary to express emotions through attitudes. It's necessary to express emotion through feelings because those things prevent you from having to drop down to behaviors. It's very important. This is a very important model. We're going to spend more time on this in the weeks to come. I wanted to get you thinking about it because it applies in relationship to you. It goes back to thinking. You go back to thinking about those first 3 years of life. You go back to thinking about yourself as a child, what your messages were in relationship to your own attitudes and feeling expressions, because that's going to dictate your ability to create a framework, a healthy framework for your child's experience. And that's going to bring us to the end of today's session. I hope you enjoyed it. I think there's a lot for you to be able to focus on. I'm sorry about the technical difficulties. So that's probably going to affect the recording a little bit. I'm not sure how, but I'll make sure everyone gets it. But reflect on these things. This is so important. This is a foundation. This is a building block for everything else that's coming. Everything else that's coming builds on this foundational understanding. And you think about if you miss, and that's a part of why I send the quiz after each day, is because if you miss one class, one session, then you miss a building block, which is going to make sense to you later as we get into the model. And so it's just very important to keep building, you're building a foundation. I know some of you may be, in a really tough situation with your child. This is going to help you more than anything. Stop. I want to encourage you to take a deep breath. Tell yourself it's going to be okay, because it is. It's going to be okay. Rushing and being frantic is only creating more cortisol. You have to interrupt that. You have to create some oxytocin. Go out and have some fun today. Do something fun. It's Saturday. It's going to be beautiful. It's going to be beautiful where I'm at. Go out and do something that's fun. Go out and do something that's going to release oxytocin. It's going to be okay. Slow down. Keep reviewing these sessions because these are building blocks. This is what's going to get you to where you want to be. All right. God bless each and every one of you. And I look forward to talking to you. Email me any questions you might have. And we'll talk soon. See you in the next session.